This is the O Sacred Head score breakdown, or alternatively, a selection of compositional ideas and techniques I learned while studying as a music composition major at the University of Northwestern St. Paul under the tutelage of Dr. Joshua Bowder and some of his colleagues. Let's get started then, shall we? First, for those unaware, let me clarify that I did not write this song, I only arranged it. The text was written in Latin, likely by a guy who died in 1250. The melody was written for a different text by a guy with a relatively short Wikipedia page. It was then paired with a German translation of the Latin text by a guy with an even shorter Wikipedia page, and then arranged by a guy with a very long Wikipedia page. Fast forward a few hundred years to Amy Grant singing it on a particularly stormy day with the recording studio windows open, and that is the first exposure to it I can remember. My arrangement opens with a C major chord, but not just any C major chord, one that specifically mimics the harmonic series, which is probably my favorite concept in all of music, but let's not get sidetracked by that here. Although I wouldn't credit all of my knowledge of the harmonic series to UNW, I do remember learning about it in Analytic Techniques, a class I liked so much that I sat in on many of its sessions the next time it was offered. That is then followed by a host of other chords that slowly make their way up an octave. The last two chords of this sequence make use of one of my favorite cadential movements, flat 2 major 7 to 1. This is another technique I can't really credit to UNW, but it is related to the Neapolitan chord, which is something that I definitely did learn at school, so that sort of counts, I guess. We then get verse 1, which is heavily inspired by Bach's harmonization. Learned about Bach in music history and studied counterpoint for a semester in private lessons. That's 2 more points for UNW. There isn't a lot to say about this verse, just a lot of thirds, contrary motion, and a distinct lack of parallel fifths. And then literally a bar later, there's a parallel fifth. I don't think we're in the Baroque era anymore, Toto. That's right, Toto, barks back. We're entering Impressionism, sorta. What I mean is that I used some planing in this verse, a technique I learned in Theory 4, I think. Debussy used it sometimes, and he's basically the only impressionist that matters, right? At measure 36, I apparently got bored of planing, so I used another technique, text painting. That one goes way back to Theory 2, I believe. On the text, Here I Fall, the chord falls an octave. That's it. This next one isn't really a named technique, but I just personally really love continual stepwise lines. The bass line for Rutter's The Lord Bless You and Keep You is absolutely gorgeous, so I wrote one here that spans an octave and a third. For the next transition and verse, we get more Impressionism, this time in the form of bell tones. Bell tones aren't always voiced like this, and they're arguably more convincing as a bell if they're chromatically identical, but beauty takes center stage in my philosophy of composition, so I decided to go diatonic with them. The importance of beauty is a sort of unexpected thing I learned at UNW, thanks primarily to dear Dr. Bowder. Another more sneaky technique I implemented here is the motivic self-insertion, a technique I learned in Theory 4 when we discussed Shostakovich's String Quartet No. 8. My usage of the self-insert isn't saying anywhere near as much as Shosti's is in that piece. I simply try to stick it in every piece of music I write. The motif is 3-5-1-2, and it shows up at the beginning of the bell melody. The motif also doesn't correlate to my name, like Shosti's or Bach's for that matter, but was chosen simply for its versatility. Once verse 3 actually kicks in, we get a pretty conventional pedal tone. You could argue that it's been there for 8 measures already, and although I would agree with that, what makes the one at measure 51 special is that it kind of sounds like thunder, which is a reference to that Amy Grant recording. Halfway through the verse, that pedal switches from a 1 to a 5 to add a bit more tension, and the bell melody changes to, you guessed it, another technique I learned at UNW, augmentation. If you read only the bell tones that have tenutos, you get the first 7 notes of the melody. Da 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 da. I knew I wanted to modulate up for the final verse, so I employed a couple more theory techniques. A common tone chromatic median key change, and the modest Mussorgsky-Boris Godunov thing where you alternate between dominant 7th chords a tritone apart. Also in this transition, triplets are introduced, which will carry through to the end of the piece. Triplets and or 3/4 time in my mind are kind of like sacred music shorthand for referencing the Trinity, so I thought it fitting to implement them for the final verse. They also just add a lot more activity to the accompaniment, which I think works quite well. One final thing I learned specifically from Bowder is the emotional and intellectual satisfaction of ending a piece the way you started it, which can take form in a variety of ways, 2 of which I implemented here. One, the general downward motion and register is a sort of mirror for how the piece started, and two, I was able to squeeze in another flat 2 major 7 to 1 cadence, landing us on the exact same chord that opened the piece. So yeah, that's the piece. It was premiered at my very last GSR at UNW, and while explaining all the different compositional ideas that went into it to my mother, I realized that it's a very nice representation of the things I've learned while at music school, so I figured I'd write them down in the form of a video essay. If you want to listen to the piece, I'll have it linked in the description. I hope you enjoyed. Leave a comment if you feel so led, and Soli Deo Gloria.